And welcome to the second video within this week's series. This time in this video, we are going to be looking at an idea that's referred to as loops. Loops are part of what make PHP and similar coding languages really powerful, especially when we start working with databases. Because the cool thing about loops is they allow us to go through the same block of code a specified number of times. For example, think about when you look at an e-commerce site, and on that site you have the catalog page where there's a whole listing of items. Each item has a picture, it has the name of the item, a brief description of the item, a price for the item. Well, what it's doing is it is looping through a block of code, and in this case pulling up variables from databases that are saying, okay, this little block of code just simply says show a picture here, the title here, the description here, and the price here. And keep going through that a specified number of times. So if there's 24 items on a page, keep going through it 24 times and then stop. It's way better than having to rewrite that whole code over and over and over again, which is what we'd have to do if we were working with just HTML. This is the cool part about working with PHP. It makes some of the things that we do much, much more efficient. So just as there were 3 types of conditionals, there are 4 types of loops, and one of which you got to see just a sneak peek of last week, which was the ForEach loop. So we're going to kind of tackle each of these, which is the first one is the easiest loop. It's the while loop, and it just loops through the block of code as long as the condition that we've assigned it is true, and it'll just keep going. DoWhile is very similar, but what it does is we give it a statement first, and this is the block of code that it goes through first, and then it goes through a loop and keeps doing it just like the while statement, because you'll see that this is a do statement followed by a while statement to create this. And so the while loop portion of this will just keep going through it as long as the condition is true. The for loop, which is probably the most powerful of the loops that we have, probably one of the most frequently used. It is also probably one of the most difficult to understand how exactly it works. But what it does is it loops through a block of code a specified number of times, and you actually specify. So remember I said that in the previous example where I talked about an e-commerce site and it's displaying 24 items on a page, it would basically go through that code and we say, no, we know we want it to go through 24 times, and so it would display it that even if there were thousands of items. And the last is the ForEach loop, and this is the one that we did last week when looking at arrays, and this is a type of loop that specifically and only works with arrays, and it loops through a block of code for each element in an array, and when it hits the end of the array, it's done. So let's take a look at how we do loops. Some of this should look a little bit familiar from when we just looked at the if statements in our conditionals. In this case, we have the word while instead of if, but we're still testing a condition. So if you remember, a loop will go through as long as the condition is met. So then in the parentheses, just like the conditional in the if statement, we have the conditional statement or the truth statement put between the parentheses, and then we open it up with a curly bracket, and at the end we close it with a curly bracket, and what's in between is the action to take as long as the condition is met. So in this case, we are saying that x equals 1. And so our while loop basically says that as long as x is less than or equal to 5, then echo the statement this number is $x. So it would go through and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because it's less than or equal to. And the reason it's going to be able to do that is look at our friend the increment. We are post-incrementing this. So after this, what it's basically saying is in this loop, go through and echo the number is the variable for x, so it would start with 1, and after it's done, so post increment, add 1. So then the next time through the loop, it would come back and it would say this number is 2. And then it would add 1. And so on and so forth until it meets the condition. And once it does, it will stop. So that's the while loop. It's pretty straightforward because there's just a simple condition and the actions within are whatever you include, and it's all contained within the curly brackets. So now let's take the DoWhile loop. So it's a little bit different. You'll see at first it says do. And what that means is it's going to do what it sees in that first portion first. So it's just going to echo this number is, in this case, if we start with the first variable again, it's x equals 1. So this number is 1, and then add 1. That's it for the do statement. But then it keeps saying, run through this again while x is less than or equal to 5. There are instances where you would use these to use a do while versus a while. I don't have any examples right at the top of my head. Again, please reference your book. It will give you some ideas and talk about this. The ones that we'll probably be focusing on more is the for loop, because the for loop kind of gives us the most control over what we are doing. And because you'll see within its parenthesis, there's more items. Like if we go back here, it's just the while and then there's a parenthesis and a statement. In a for loop, we actually have 3 elements. And these 3 elements are important to understand what it is that they are doing in order to create your loop. In the first, it's called the init counter or the initial counter. This goes through a specified number of times, but it has to start your counter someplace. So in this case, we're simply saying x equals 0. This is the counter. This doesn't mean your variable. So we're saying that it's starting the loop counter value at 1, and then we go into what's called the test counter. Now this test counter is the same thing that we've been seeing as our conditional statements in the while loop and in the if conditional statements. So in this case, we're testing this to see if it's true. So in this case, we're saying x needs to be less than or equal to 10. And if it's true, it'll keep going through the loop. And if it's false, it will stop. The final, which should be familiar from what we just did in the while loop, is the increment counter. So what it's doing is each time it goes through the loop, it increases the loop counter value. So let's go through this. I'm going to back up. So what it's going to do the first time is it's going to say, this is 0. 0 is less than 10. So continue on with the loop. Increment. So now it's 1. Now we're back at this. Now this is actually x equals 1. 1 is less than 10. Add 1. Now it says x equals 2. X is still less than 10. And add 1. And so on and so forth until it gets to 10, because we're saying it has to be less than or equal to 10, and then it will stop. So let's take a look at how this executes in an actual written out code with the rest of it. So here it is, and you're just going to simply say, in this case, it's just going to keep echoing this out. So we're going to say for x equals 0, x is less than or equal to 10, and then add 1. We're just going to say this number is. This will basically count us up from 0 to 10. So for example, going back to our e-commerce where we're saying we want 24 items on a page, we can specify that this counter starts at 0 and it's talking about that item. It's going to keep rolling through the code. And in this echo box, we could put a link to an image and it would pull where that image is at. It could echo out the title variable. It could echo out the description. And each of these would be associated with a location within a database. And that's where that number comes from. So it'd be like going through row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, until it meets the criterion, in which case in the e-commerce site we're saying is up to 24. So it's going to keep going through this loop and it's going to keep displaying this code until it gets to the number that we've told it to stop. The last one simply works with arrays. And we did this last week with, I'm trying to remember which which element it was in the arrays group that we talked about. I think it was when we did the associative arrays and we had it run each of the pairings. Well, this is an example of a for each with just a simple array. So in this case, I just took the colors of the rainbow, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet as part of our array, and said echo, and we're just going to make a statement first that just simply says display the colors of the rainbow. And after that, we start our loop. And it says for each colors as value. And that as value means that whatever the value is inside of that array. And then it just says echo value. So it's going to keep echoing each one until it runs out. So you will end up with a list that shows up as red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet running down the page because there is a line break after each one of these. But remember, for each loops only work with arrays. And now we're ready to tackle the remaining tasks in the conditional and loops exercise. Once you are done, you're ready to move on to the next, which is how we're going to actually start working with some user-added data. So we're not quite to using databases, but we're going to be moving on to forms in the next video. But up till now, you'll be able to complete the entire conditionals and loops exercise using what you've seen in this video, as well as what's in the textbook. Remember, we're in chapter 2, as well as anything that you might find out on W3 Schools or php.net.